Hey friends, this is Marilyn from tarotclarity.com, and today's video is based on a question that one of my subscribers sent me in a personal email, and I thought it was a great question, and with her permission I am able to give her a shout out by name. Caroline, thank you for the great question, because I think it's really it will serve it well as a instructional moment. Now, the question that Caroline had is that she's reading currently the Tarot Open Reading Yov Ben Dov book, and she came upon the Nine of Batons and a TDM, and what this individual shares about the meaning of 9 batons in the TDM. But she's trying to reconcile it because she has a Sarton Flamand deck. This particular one, this dodal, I want to point out, my deck creators, was published by Tarot Sheet Revival, and then this the Sarton Flamand that I'm using is one by Marco Benedetti. Now you'll notice the big difference between the uncluttered TDM, and then we have the inclusion of foliage on the sides. And on page 236, I think it was, the Ben Dov book discusses the meaning, or the meaning of the 9 of batons as being uncluttered, because all the other numbers that came before this had foliage around it, and this one is uncluttered. Okay, and so that becomes part of the meaning. So now we get down to the brass tacks, I think, is to remember to read the deck, okay? And also bear in mind that when the TDM deck was created, it was the French's interpretation of the Italian Tarocchi. And now the Italian were playing card games for 200 years, it seems, before we see it surface in France. I'm sure there can be other decks that'll pop up that will indicate otherwise. But the earliest TDM, like 1639, is like 200 years after the earliest Tarocchi deck in Italy. So the game Tarocchi migrated to France, right? And the French said there's this great game that's being played over in Italy. And so they reinterpreted the cards. They reinterpreted the imagery to suit them. Now, we all know that what the French did, especially in older days, became very fashionable, because the French were known to be fashionable. In fact, today, when we play cards, the equivalent of 9 batons, which I think would be the 9 of clubs, some people may say otherwise, but that's fine. My own guessing is that it would be the 9 of clubs, right? We still use the French layout. This is a French style, and we've been using it for a long time. So the French were very influential in all things, including the game of tarot. Now, the game of Tarocchi. Now, bear in mind, what was the objective in this deck was, I think, 1611. I'm using the dodal. Well, the objective was to play a card game. That was the objective. So if that was the objective, they weren't, creating cards with esoteric meanings, right? People came later, 200 years after this, maybe 300 years after this, to apply meaning to the cards, to try to make sense of these cards. But at the time, the point was to create a card game and to create cards that were easy to see. And so because the other batons had all the embellishments that made it lovely, when they got to the 9, it started getting cluttered, right? Now, although you could count clearly what there's 9 batons, but it's even more quick if you can look on the sides and see the 9. So how did they make it fanciful? They couldn't put the flowers in. Well, maybe they articulated the crisscross hatching in the center to make it a little more interesting. But bear in mind, it was not not intended to be interpreted. Now, one of the beautiful things about reading a deck, and in this case, the Nine of Batons, you could see it as a lack of clutter. Now, it looks very cluttered because it's congested. There's a lot of congestion here. It literally is an X with a line through it, but there is no room for the extra stuff, So if it strikes you in the context of a question that you're reading, that this is an unencumbered number without all the extra floral embellishments, okay, you could say that, you could say that. But when you're reading the Nine of Batons from the Sarton Tarot Flamand, which is what prompted her to ask this question, we see that there are embellishments. And again, they were still just playing a card game. They weren't looking for interpretations. They weren't, they weren't concerned with how adding additional embellishments would clutter the interpretive meaning. I mean, Yov came up with this, Yov Ben-Dov came up with this interpretation, 400 years after the deck was played in France, right? So when it moved on to Belgium, they said, well, we can put pretty flowers on the edges, but we don't need the edges for the number because we've got innovation here. And so they put a 9 in the center. Now this is film. The number 9 is correct here. I don't know how it'll film. So they put the number 9 in there, right? So now it frees up the edges so they can put whatever pretty niceties that they saw fit. So now you wouldn't maybe read these two cards in the same way, but why should you? If you're interpreting the deck, you don't really have to read this as you would a Nine of Batons in the Dodal. In fact, you may get a different meaning or a different understanding depending on the nature of the question. You may say, there's so much going on on this page, in this card. It's cramped. Are you overthinking? Are you overdoing? Are you overextending yourself? And so in that way, you get a different meaning altogether, because here you might say, actually, it could give you kind of a similar meaning, because this card could be suggesting, there's no encumbrances. So right now, advance in your query, or your question, advance to answer your own question. Try to eliminate, additional things you don't need on your plate. I mean, I'm just trying to do the spur of the moment here. And here, you might come up with a very similar, meaning, such as in you have too much going on. Try to clear it up a little bit. So even though they're different, you could come down with the same kind of understanding, or seeing the extra foliage on this could, depending on the context of the question, if the person says, I'm thinking of going, I have a couple choices this weekend. I could go to a beautiful botanical garden with my family and friends, or I could go to a jazz concert or something like that. And if this card were to pop up with all the beautiful foliage, and I would see it, I'd say, wow, probably go to the botanical garden. So you read the card in the context of the question, and you read the deck. Now, I don't know that I would see a botanical garden in this. And so often when I know you experience this, because I do on the regular. When you're using a deck, sometimes I'll get a new understanding, or I'll interpret the cards in a way that I never would have seen had I used a different deck. The same cards from a different deck wouldn't yield the same answer. So it's always, I think, important to read the deck, and I wouldn't worry so much. I mean, the deck itself is called Sarton Flamand, or Tarot Flamand. So it's telling you it's not like a TDM, right, per se. It's the Flemish version of a TDM. And just as the Italian folks invented the game of tarocchi, and they played it for 200 years before it migrated to France. When it got over to France, the French said, well, we want to make it a simple game. We wanted to make it easy to see, right? And then they came up with this innovation after, right? So they were always innovative, I think, with playing cards. You know, the design was just like, the point was to make it less fussy. So it was just about playing the game. And even the Italians reabsorbed the game of tarot. I mean, they had tarot. It migrated to France. And then when the French came up with the Tarot of Marseille, which again was strictly playing cards, you know, it wasn't for interpretation. When the Italian card makers were seeing what the French were doing, they were like, they took our game. I mean, I don't know if they said that like that, but then they just said, hey, you know, that's our game. We could do it too. So then they maybe started to emulate the French design because it was so popular, right? I mean, you want to be popular. You want your item to sell. So if the French style was selling, it makes sense to reason that the Italians would have reabsorbed their game of tarot as it came back to them in the form of tarot, came back as a different animal. And so the Italians adjusted. And so they had their game that they knew intimately well, but they recognized that the French design was popular. And so they incorporated more of a French design when they published their decks, probably after the 1700s is my guess, or maybe even the 1800s. And, when I learned, we had to walk 3 miles to school, But when I learned tarot, we didn't have the benefit of like the internet, and there were no books that we could get. I mean, remember, I was in suburban Philadelphia, so I didn't have the benefit of growing up in a European country or culture where the game of tarot or the game of tarot was played in tournaments. It was a game, right? We didn't have that. By the time tarot arrived to the United States in the 70s, for a kid like myself, it arrived to us exclusively as fortune telling. It arrived to us as Rider-Waite-Smith. Now, I saw it on the Dark Shadows show, and I've shared that a number of times. So for me, even though it was the 1JJ Swiss, which was a completely different deck than the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, it still came to me as a fortune telling device or as a mystical device. I don't necessarily see it as fortune telling anymore, but that's how it was packaged and brought to the United States. So we had this other view. So many times, I think Americans, perhaps in particular, because we don't have the history of tarot or tarot being played in tournaments, our perspective of the deck is interpretive. So we want to make sense of what these pip cards mean. But I'm glad I grew up when I didn't have access to a lot of different things. Now, I bought these books, and I have a lot of very good books, on tarot. But by the time I read them, I already came to terms with how I interpret the cards. And so I didn't see the need to suddenly say, well, this guy came along 400 years after the game was being played in France, and now he's telling us what this card means. Well, my interpretation or my understanding of the card is just as valid as his is, and I've been doing it for 50 years. So I'm no less valid, as none of you are. You're no less valid. So you don't have to feel like you have to you have to reconcile these two cards, that this is TDM, because it's not. It's the Flemish interpretation of the TDM, just as the TDM is the French interpretation of tarot. Now, before I hang up on this dissertation, I will say that I'm convinced, and I've said it a number of times, that there were little old ladies in Italy who were interpreting the cards, because from anytime you have anything, I mean, from the beginning of days, they interpreted the clouds, people, there have always been people like us who interpret things, who try to make sense of stuff, and there's certain people who are sensitive to images. And there is, I don't remember which of my books sourced this, where I got this information from, but it stuck with me. It stuck with me that in the early days of playing the cards in Italy, at playing Tarocchi, the cards that were left on the table were interpreted for each individual. And maybe a little poem was made, they just tried to make sense of the cards that were on the table. And so they tried to have a little fun pastime. It was an unofficial aspect of the game. It wasn't maybe how Tarocchi was played, but one of the offshoots of it was to just create a poem, because they were very poetic and erudite people, those Italians in northern Italy. And, that was their entertainment. So it's only a stone's throw away if you're interpreting cards to make a little, fun poem about a person who whose cards were laid out on the table. It's only a stone's throw away from being interpreted, which is what happened, So I'm convinced that the little old ladies everywhere were, and maybe some men were interpreting, because for women, like with my own great grandmother, Josefa, it probably was an option for women to have money, to make money, because even though it wasn't the highest socially ranked thing on the social ladder, it was better than being, you know what, right? So it offered women an opportunity to make some money. That's how I take it. And that's how I see my Josefa, my ancestor, struggling, to stay afloat, and she was a maid, but she had the side hustle where she was an interpreter of the cards. She was trying to keep herself, even though people would look at her and say, well, she was low ranking, she was a maid, and she was a tarot slinger or card slinger. But it was one of the, and she read tea leaves too. I have a cup over here. That wasn't hers, but I bought it in honor of her, a tea reading cup. It was a way for women to make money to, not have to prostitute themselves, So I just got off on that little diatribe too. But see, it was a learning moment. It was a great question, Caroline. I thank you so much for asking it and for giving permission to use your name and to, talk about this topic. And I hope I did answer the question. But I hope I answered the question. Sometimes I go off on tangents. But until next time, friends, peace, stay well, and be kind.